Should I call you Fran or Francesca?
Let's stick with Fran.
Fran, okay, Fran, thanks very much for agreeing to this chat. Could you just tell me a little bit about the work that you've been doing in Africa, in particular the research you've done in Mozambique?
Sure. I started my research project in Mozambique in 2011, and that was as part of my doctoral study. I wanted to engage a bit more with a policy that indicates that girls who get pregnant in school are then transferred to night courses. Initially, I just thought this was a little bit unfair, and therefore I just wanted to see what was the rationale for it at the level of the Ministry of Education, but also how this policy was then implemented within certain schools, and what students in general, but young women and young men especially, felt about it. It's not just young women that were affected by the policy, but also those that might not have been directly affected but still saw some space for discussion. This culminated in 2014 when I finished my doctoral project, and the indications, the suggestion that I developed out of it is that possibly this measure is not so much to be understood in relation to what girls actually want to do and be, but is a way of coping with an educational system that is very, very weak compared to the demands that it needs to respond to. So trying to exclude the factors in girls from education means having fewer students to focus upon, and that in general terms might render teachers' jobs, the educational system aims a bit more feasible, a bit more approachable in the long term. I went back to Mozambique in 2007 and 17, and this was because I wanted to catch up with people that had taken part in my study in 2011 to 2014, and also wanted to check at what stage the negotiations about the policies were, because obviously the results of my PhD suggested that people were not very happy about this policy. I was very happy to find out that the policy was undergoing a process of revision, although this wasn't the first one, and the previous one in 2015 did not complete, so it was abandoned for lack of opportunity to reach consensus. The negotiations are now ongoing, and I'm trying to maintain my relationships with the Ministry of Education and those that are concerned with that revision in order to see whether there is further scope for investigation and possibly establish more sustainable relationships for the future.
What sort of impact would you like the study to have? You mentioned the focus on pregnant girls, and also mentioned to me young fathers. Mm-hmm. So as a result of the study, what would you like to be seeing happening, perhaps not just in Mozambique, I guess in other parts of Africa as well?
Yeah, I think there is a very strong clash between education on one hand and pregnancy and parenthood on the other hand. But I find that this clash has been mostly constructed by mainstream literature, and if you look at big data, it's possibly what you see. I think what you can also see once you go in the field, once you start talking with people, is that being a parent, whether you're a father or a mother, doesn't necessarily prevent you from engaging with your education, from having aspirations, from wanting to do things with your life. And therefore I see this study as being part of a broader project that tries to break that opposition between education and parenthood. I think it can be both.
That's really interesting. And you were telling me the study was based in a town near the border. I'm not sure border with which country. I didn't ask you that. But could you tell me a little bit about the specific location and perhaps some of the interesting things that you found in that culture and context?
Yes. So this study was carried out in the capital, in Maputo, and also in a small neighboring town, some 3 hours away from Maputo, at the border with South Africa. So this town, Maguda, is obviously a very different context from the urban environment. So it's mainly rural. It's got a very big factory, a sugar cane factory, but also is characterized by a very transient kind of community which is divided between South Africa, which offers a lot more opportunities for employment, and Mozambique. That is particularly evident within gender relations. So it's a place where it's much more likely that men would spend considerable amount of time in South Africa being engaged with paid employment, and then have families in this little town in Mozambique. This is the same process that's been going on for ages in Mozambique, because people always used to move seasonally to South Africa to work in mines, for instance. So the transnationality of the relationship between Mozambique and South Africa is nothing new, but the practical implications and the dynamics that characterize border cities now are changing a little bit. So, for instance, what you start to see is that yes, men are mostly the ones who move, and women are the ones who stay behind, but women are also starting to move, but also means that the women who stay behind have a position of increased authority, and that works in weird ways within educational system as well, because on one hand you might think that the more educated you are, the more possibilities you have for developing power and doing things that matter to you and enable you to bring in a higher income. At the same time, you might have more pressing necessity that prevents you from going to school altogether, because you're making up for lack of a male figure, and having a sugarcane factory next door, meaning that there's quite a lot of competition going on between the factory and schools.
It's really interesting, because it sort of highlights the importance of considering some of these variables to do with the context, and this particular context of being close to the border when designing research, and presumably also when thinking about the policy implications.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find that educational systems are often necessarily, because obviously they are developed at state level, a bit too strict, a bit too inflexible in order to respond to the needs of specific populations. So, for instance, in this town, the degree of dropout, lack of attendance was huge, and that's because the demands on people's times are varied. So people would go to South Africa for a period of time, people would be engaged in seasonality, people would have children, and all of these aspects used to take them away from school. But those schools that were in a position to respond to that, so for instance, specific institutions that would develop modular tuition, were in a position to achieve better results and therefore better respond to the educational needs of the population.
You mentioned modular tuition. Could you just give a brief explanation as to what that looks like?
Yes, of course. So, for instance, one school I worked with, and interestingly, it was a religious institution, but mind you, Mozambique is a former Portuguese colony, so there is an underlying assumption of Catholicism in many of the state institutions. So this specific institution was a school developed by a Portuguese church, and they offered tuition that was modular in that it was developed for a few months, and in those months people would get a first step of a degree, for instance, so they could then go off and do other things. Say you're going to school for 3 months or 6 months and you would get the first step of a degree, then go off and do other things, work on agriculture, go to South Africa and do whatever it is that people do. Young women who had children as well fell into this group, and then go back to school when the time is right, when you had to put together enough money to cover the opportunity cost, and that would not have consequences on the time that you spent in education, because you wouldn't have to go back at the beginning of the cycle, but you had already achieved a module, and then you could just complement with another module, and so on and so forth.
So much more sort of flexible engagement and re-engagement with the education system.
Yes, and that cut out opportunities for discrimination as well, because, for instance, they didn't even know which girls had had babies. They just knew that some people went 3 months, achieved a module, then went off. They could have been, doing agricultural work, they could have had a baby and then came back. And this wasn't a cause for concern, but the relationship between the school and the individual and the family was much looser.
Yes. And final question around the methods and tools. Have you found as a result of this study and the context that you've been focused on that certain methods and tools have emerged and been developed that would be useful elsewhere? And what are you looking to do to build on this study?
I've relied mainly on qualitative methods, meaning that I've spent a lot of time talking to people. I've run a few focus groups, and I found that this has been essential, but also spending time with people and trying to understand what constraints they're facing, because most people would not be able to identify what it is exactly that forces them to make the choices that they take. And that's the same for us as well. If you don't live my life, you don't know exactly what it is that I'm facing at home after I leave my office. So, and that is something that has an impact on what I can and cannot do when I'm at work. So I think that's key. With working with young people specifically, I think it's very important to try and enable them to challenge their own perception a little bit more. And sometimes I found that, for instance, using theatre as a way of for them to express how they saw the world would enable them to develop a definite perception of what was going on without forcing them to have a direct engagement. So, for instance, I could ask a young woman, how did you feel when you found out that you were pregnant and you knew that they would have forced you to transfer to night courses? But that's quite a direct question, and it involves a whole set of different levels, from an emotional level, from a strategic level, from a relational levels with others, and it's very hard to respond to that question, especially if you're dealing with someone you've never seen before. However, if I work with a group of people and I ask them to set up a play that concerns exactly the same thing, you've got boy A, girl B, they are expecting a baby, what's going on, she's going to school, he's going to school, these are their families, what is happening and why is it happening? And by being there and trying to map how they set up this play, what kind of notions underpin the decisions they make, you can access a lot more about what they really think.
Well, thank you very much, and wish you all the very best with the future studies. It's a really fascinating and important area.
Thank you very much.